When Guy Fawkes climbed those wooden steps on the bitter morning of January 31st, 1606, he carried with him a secret act of defiance that would deny his captors the ending they craved. That moment, hidden beneath centuries of myth and masked rebellion, was the last chapter of a man whose death was designed to be a spectacle, a gruesome performance meant to terrify a nation into obedience. Most of us know Guy Fawkes only as a mask, a smirking face of rebellion worn on bonfires and protests. But the man behind the mask met an end that reveals not only the cruelty of his age, but also a single act of desperate courage. His final choice ensured that, though his body was broken, his spirit would be remembered in whispers, fires, and, eventually, in the pages of history. The shadow of treason England in 1605 was a powder keg of tension. For decades, Catholics had lived as second-class citizens under Protestant rule, watched with suspicion, fined, and even executed for practicing their faith. King James I, newly crowned, offered them no reprieve. To the Catholic minority, hope had turned to desperation. It was in this climate that Robert Catesby conceived a plan so audacious that it seemed destined either for glory or destruction. The Gunpowder Plot. 36 barrels of explosive powder hidden beneath the House of Lords, set to ignite during the King's grand state opening of Parliament. One blast would have killed not only the King, but his family, his ministers, the bishops, the judges, and virtually the entire Protestant ruling class of England. From the ashes, the conspirators dreamed, Catholic rule would rise again. But plots are fragile things. A single anonymous letter revealed enough to raise suspicion. On the night of November 4th, 1605, guards discovered Guy Fawkes, a soldier hardened by war, sitting watch over the barrels of powder. He did not resist. He was captured, interrogated, and led to the Tower of London, where his torment truly began. The machinery of Pain the Tower was no ordinary prison. It was a machine built to crush human will, a place where hope entered and screams left. Guy Fawkes was about to discover the full measure of England's law against traitors. King James himself ordered that the gentler tortures be used first. It was a chilling phrase, for in the Tower, gentle meant sleep deprivation, shackles, and iron manacles that suspended the victim by the wrists until shoulders tore from their sockets. When that failed, the rack was employed, the infamous wooden frame with rollers that pulled the body in opposite directions. Bones cracked, joints burst, ligaments tore, until a man became a stretched shadow of himself. Records from the Tower still preserve Fawkes's confessions. His first signature is bold, steady. Days later, the same hand drags across the page like that of a dying man, a barely legible scrawl. Each stroke of the pen is evidence of hours of agony. Yet even through this torment, he revealed little. His loyalty to his fellow conspirators remained unshaken, though the state already knew their names. His silence was not enough to save him. The punishment for treason was already decided: hanging, drawing, and quartering, the crown's most barbaric ritual. The ordeal of treason. This execution was not simply death. It was theater. On the morning of January 31st, Guy Fawkes and his surviving conspirators were dragged through the muddy streets on wooden hurdles. This humiliation robbed the condemned of dignity, forcing them to endure jeers, blows, and filth, hurled by the crowd. To the people, this was not merely justice, it was entertainment. A living sermon on the power of the crown. The scaffold in Old Palace Yard, Westminster, was built tall, so the multitude could watch. The ritual would unfold in stages, each carefully timed. The hanging the traitor was suspended by the neck, just until unconsciousness crept near, but not death. Executioners prided themselves on cutting the rope at the precise moment to prolong awareness. The drawing stripped of clothing. The victim's abdomen was slit open. The executioner thrust his hands inside, pulling out entrails and, in some cases, burning them before the victim's very eyes. All of this, while the heart still beat. The quartering finally. The body was hacked apart with axe and knife. Limbs severed, head cut off. Pieces displayed on spikes around London Bridge serving as the Crown's grotesque gallery of warning. This was the fate that awaited Guy Fawkes. It was designed not just to kill, but to annihilate both flesh and spirit, leaving only terror behind. The last defiance, but Guy Fawkes would not allow himself to be paraded through each act of torment. As the noose was placed around his neck, he summoned what strength remained and leaped from the scaffold. His neck broke instantly. Death came in a heartbeat, not in the hours of agony the king had intended. The crowd gasped. In one motion, he had stolen from King James the spectacle that was meant to be the Crown's triumph. Though his body would still be mutilated, quartered, and displayed, the man himself had denied them the satisfaction of his screams. The legacy of fire, the Gunpowder Plot, had failed. The conspirators were dead. Yet, in time, the story of Guy Fawkes would ignite in ways no one could have foreseen. Every November 5th, bonfires blazed to celebrate the survival of king and parliament, and effigies of Fawkes were burned in scorn. But as centuries passed, the image of Fawkes transformed. From traitor, he became symbol. From failed conspirator, he became mask. A man who, in his final act, chose his own ending rather than submit to calculated cruelty. His story remains one of the darkest, most chilling reminders of how justice in Tudor and Stuart England was not about fairness, but fear. And so, every spark on Bonfire Night carries an echo, not just of a plot that failed, but of a man who leaped into legend, snapping his neck to deny a king his show. Progression of his physical deterioration. His initial signature, bold and confident, gradually deteriorated into barely legible scratches as his hands were systematically destroyed. The scavenger's daughter, another favorite device of Tower. Torturers worked in reverse to the rack, compressing the victim's body into an increasingly small space until ribs cracked and breathing became nearly impossible. This instrument was particularly effective at breaking the will of prisoners who had initially resisted the rack's stretching torments. Manacles provided a more subtle form of torture, suspending victims by their wrists for hours or days at a time. The weight of the body gradually dislocated shoulders and wrists while circulation was cut off to the hands and arms. Prisoners subjected to prolonged manacling often suffered permanent nerve damage, losing the use of their hands, even if they survived their eventual execution. The Tower's torturers were skilled professionals who understood human anatomy with surgical precision. They knew exactly how much pressure to apply, how long to maintain tension, and when to allow brief respites to prevent unconsciousness. Their goal wasn't simply to inflict pain. It was to break the human spirit while maintaining enough physical integrity to ensure the victim could still provide useful information. Between torture sessions, prisoners were returned to cells designed to prevent recovery. The cramped, unheated spaces combined with minimal food and water ensured that each day brought fresh weakness and despair. The psychological impact of knowing that each sunrise might bring another session of methodical destruction was often more effective than the physical torture itself. The morning of January 31st, 66,006 dawned. Gray and bitter cold, with frost covering the cobblestones of London's streets. Guy Fawkes awoke in his tower cell, knowing that this day would end with his death. But the manner of that death remained a source of dread that had haunted his sleepless nights since his sentencing. The sounds of construction had been audible for days as carpenters erected the scaffold that would serve as the stage for his prolonged agony. The procession from the Tower to Old Palace Yard was designed as a final act of public humiliation. Fawkes, along with his fellow conspirators Thomas Winter, Ambrose Rookwood, and Robert Keyes, were dragged through the streets on hurdles, their bodies already weakened by months of torture and imprisonment. The crowds that lined the route were in a festive mood, treating the occasion as a combination of justice and entertainment. Old Palace Yard had been transformed into an amphitheater of death, with the scaffold positioned to provide optimal viewing for the thousands of spectators who had gathered to witness the execution. The structure itself was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty built higher than usual, to ensure that every person in the crowd could clearly see the suffering that would unfold over the coming hours. The executioner, a man whose identity was carefully concealed behind a black hood, had prepared his tools with professional precision. The noose was positioned at exactly the right height to ensure partial strangulation without immediate death. The knives were sharpened to surgical keenness, designed to cut through human flesh with minimal resistance. The fire for burning the intestines had been carefully tended to ensure the right temperature for maximum smoke and flame. As the first of the conspirators was prepared for execution, the crowd fell into an expectant silence. The ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering had become so familiar to London audiences that they knew exactly what to expect. The partial hanging, the cutting down while still alive, the opening of the abdomen, the removal and burning of the intestines, and finally, the quartering of the still living body. Guy Fawkes watched as his companions endured their prescribed deaths, each execution following the same horrific pattern. Thomas Winter was the first to die, his screams echoing across the yard as the executioner methodically dismantled his body. Ambrose Rookwood followed, then Robert Keyes, each death serving as a preview of what awaited Fawkes as the final victim. The crowd's attention was now focused entirely on Guy Fawkes as he was led to the scaffold. His legs, weakened by months of torture, barely supported his weight as he climbed the wooden steps. The executioner began his final preparations, adjusting the noose and positioning the victim for optimal effect. But what happened next would transform a routine execution into a moment of legendary defiance. As Guy Fawkes stood at the edge of the scaffold, the full horror of his intended fate stretched before him like a road map of agony. He had witnessed the systematic destruction of his three companions, had heard their screams, and smelled the smoke from their burning intestines. The knowledge that he was destined for the same methodical dismemberment, while conscious, created a moment of crystal-clear desperation that would define his place in history. The executioner's routine was well established and familiar. The noose would be placed around Fawkes's neck, positioned carefully to ensure partial strangulation without loss of consciousness. He would be allowed to hang just long enough to begin suffocating, his face turning purple as oxygen was cut off, but not long enough to grant him the mercy of death or unconsciousness. In that moment of final preparation, with the crowd silent, in anticipation, and the executioner reaching for the noose, Guy Fawkes made a decision that would echo through centuries. Rather than submit to the prescribed ritual of torture, he summoned what remained of his strength and leaped from the scaffold, his body plummeting toward the cobblestones below, with enough force to ensure that his neck would snap on impact. The crowd's gasp of surprise quickly turned to murmurs of disappointment, as they realized they had been robbed of their expected entertainment. The executioner, trained in the precise choreography of judicial torture, found himself facing an unprecedented situation. His victim lay motionless on the ground, neck twisted at an unnatural angle, already dead from the impact of his fall. Fawkes's desperate leap had accomplished what months of torture could not. It had wrested control of his death away from the crown and its representatives. In choosing to die by his own action, rather than submit to the prescribed ritual, he had achieved a form of victory that transcended his physical destruction. The man who had failed to blow up Parliament had succeeded in denying King James II the satisfaction of a slow, agonizing death. The executioner, however, was not to be completely denied his work. Even though Fawkes was clearly dead, the sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering had been prescribed by law, and the law would be satisfied. What followed was a grisly pantomime of execution, as the executioner carried out the prescribed dismemberment on Fawkes's lifeless corpse. The crowd watched in fascination as the executioner opened Fawkes's abdomen and removed his intestines, burning them according to the prescribed ritual. The quartering proceeded as planned, with axes and knives separating the limbs from the torso. But the essential element of the execution, the victim's conscious suffering, had been denied by Fawkes's final act of defiance. The thousands of spectators who had gathered in Old Palace Yard that January morning represented a cross-section of London society, from wealthy merchants who had paid premium prices for the best viewing positions to common laborers who had arrived before dawn to secure their place in the crowd. Their reaction to Fawkes's unexpected leap revealed the complex relationship between justice, entertainment, and public spectacle in early 17th century England. Contemporary accounts describe an initial moment of stunned silence as the crowd processed what they had witnessed. The anticipated hours of systematic torture had been reduced to a single decisive moment. Many spectators felt cheated of the entertainment they had come to see, while others expressed grudging admiration for Fawkes's courage in choosing his own death rather than submitting to prolonged agony. Pamphlets published in the days following the execution captured the mixed emotions of those who witnessed the event. Some writers condemned Fawkes's final act as a display of cowardice, arguing that a true penitent would have accepted his punishment as God's will. Others saw in his leap a demonstration of the same courage that had led him to participate in the Gunpowder Plot, a final act of defiance against authority. The Venetian ambassador Niccolò Molin wrote to the Doge, describing the execution as a spectacle that moved even the hardest hearts to pity. His diplomatic correspondence reveals that even among the international community, Fawkes's final moments were seen as a demonstration of human dignity in the face of systematic cruelty. Religious commentators struggled to place Fawkes's suicide within the context of Christian theology. Catholic sympathizers saw his death as martyrdom, while Protestant ministers condemned it as a final sin that ensured his damnation. These theological debates would continue for decades, with each side claiming Fawkes's final act as validation of their own religious perspective. The economic impact of the execution was immediate and measurable. Street vendors who had prepared for a day-long spectacle found themselves with excess food and drink, while the owners of viewing platforms discovered that disappointed customers were demanding partial refunds. The execution industry built around the assumption of prolonged suffering had to adapt to a new reality, where condemned prisoners might choose their own ending. Word of Fawkes's defiant death spread throughout England within days, carried by travelers and traders who had witnessed the execution or heard first-hand accounts. The story grew in the telling, with each retelling adding new details about his courage, his final words, or the crowd's reaction. By the time the news reached the countryside, Guy Fawkes had begun his transformation from failed terrorist to folk hero. King James I's reaction to Guy Fawkes's final act of defiance was one of barely contained fury. The elaborate execution had been planned as a demonstration of royal power, a public spectacle that would serve as a warning to any who might consider following in the conspirators' footsteps. Fawkes' leap had transformed the Crown's carefully orchestrated display of absolute authority into an embarrassing demonstration of the limits of royal control. The immediate government response focused on controlling the narrative surrounding the execution. Official accounts were quickly distributed to minimize the significance of Fawkes's final act, describing it as a moment of cowardice rather than courage. Court historians were instructed to emphasize the successful capture and punishment of the conspirators while downplaying any suggestion that the execution had not proceeded according to plan. The legal implications of Fawkes's suicide created unprecedented challenges for English jurisprudence. The sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering had been carried out on his corpse, but questions remained about whether justice had truly been served. Legal scholars debated whether the execution of a dead body satisfied the requirements of the law, and whether new provisions needed to be made for future cases where condemned prisoners might attempt similar escapes. Parliament responded by passing new legislation designed to prevent future suicide attempts by condemned traitors. The construction of scaffolds was modified to eliminate opportunities for prisoners to leap to their deaths, while additional guards were stationed to physically restrain anyone who might attempt to follow Fawkes's example. These changes represented a tacit admission that the government had been caught unprepared by his final act. The international diplomatic community watched the English government's response with great interest. Foreign ambassadors reported to their respective courts that the execution had not proceeded as planned, and that the Crown's authority had been challenged even in the moment of its supposed triumph. These reports contributed to a growing perception that English justice, while brutal, was not infallible. The Catholic community throughout Europe seized upon Fawkes's death as evidence of English Protestant cruelty. Pamphlets circulated describing the barbaric nature of hanging, drawing, and quartering, while Catholic propagandists portrayed Fawkes as a martyr who had chosen death rather than submit to heretical persecution. These publications were banned in England, but they continued to circulate underground. The Protestant establishment countered with their own propaganda campaign, emphasizing the justness of the conspirators' punishment and the mercy shown by allowing them to be executed, rather than tortured, indefinitely. These official accounts carefully avoided detailed descriptions of the intended execution method, focusing instead on the criminal's confessions and expressions of penitence. The annual commemoration of Guy Fawkes Night began almost immediately after the failed Gunpowder Plot, but the celebration evolved significantly over the centuries as public attitudes toward the man and his methods changed. What started as a straightforward celebration of the Crown's victory over Catholic terrorism gradually transformed into something more complex and ambiguous. The earliest Guy Fawkes Night celebrations were exercises in Protestant triumphalism with elaborate bonfires, representing the fires of hell that awaited Catholic traitors. Effigies of Guy Fawkes were burned with great ceremony, while crowds chanted prayers of thanksgiving for the deliverance of King James II and Parliament. These celebrations were as much about reinforcing religious and political orthodoxy as they were about commemorating a historical event. The practice of creating Guy Fawkes effigies became increasingly elaborate over time, with communities competing to create the most realistic or most symbolically powerful representation of the failed conspirator. Children would spend weeks crafting their guys from old clothes stuffed with straw, newspaper, or other materials, then parade them through the streets before consigning them to the flames. The religious significance of Guy Fawkes Night began to fade during the 18th century as English society became more secular and religiously tolerant. The celebration gradually shifted from a specifically anti-Catholic ritual to a more general, patriotic observance, emphasizing English resistance to foreign influence rather than Protestant resistance to Catholic conspiracy. The Industrial Revolution transformed Guy Fawkes Night from a primarily rural celebration to an urban spectacle. Factory workers and city dwellers embraced the tradition with enthusiasm, seeing in the annual bonfire a rare opportunity for community celebration and legitimate public disorder. The addition of fireworks to the celebration created new opportunities for spectacular displays that rivaled the original Gunpowder Plot in their explosive power. The 20th century brought new layers of meaning to Guy Fawkes Night as political activists began to appropriate the symbolism of the failed conspirator for their own purposes. The image of Guy Fawkes as a man who had dared to challenge authority resonated with revolutionary movements across the political spectrum, from Irish Republicans to English anarchists. The transformation of Guy Fawkes, from villain to anti-hero, was completed in the late 20th century, with the publication of V for Vendetta and the subsequent popularization of the Guy Fawkes mask as a symbol of resistance to authority. This modern reinterpretation completely inverted the original meaning of Guy Fawkes Night, transforming the man who had once been burned in effigy into an icon of rebellion against oppression. The legacy of Guy Fawkes's final moments extends far beyond the immediate historical context of early 17th century religious warfare. His decision to choose death over prolonged torture, established a precedent that would be remembered and invoked by subsequent generations, facing similar choices between submission and defiance. The story of Fawkes's leap from the scaffold became a touchstone for discussions about human dignity in the face of institutional cruelty. Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and Charbacaria cited his final act as evidence of the inherent barbarity of judicial torture, arguing that no state had the right to inflict such systematic suffering on any individual, regardless of their crimes. The abolition of hanging, drawing, and quartering as a form of execution in 1870 marked the end of an era of judicial cruelty that had persisted for centuries. Modern historians argue that public revulsion at executions like that intended for Guy Fawkes played a significant role in the gradual humanization of criminal justice. As society began to question whether the state should have unlimited power over the human body, the psychological impact of Fawkes's final choice continues to fascinate. Modern researchers studying extreme behavior under pressure, his decision to commit suicide rather than endure prolonged torture has been analyzed as an example of rational decision-making as an example of the slippery slope from legitimate punishment to systematic cruelty. Human rights organizations use historical examples like this to argue that any acceptance of torture, even in extreme circumstances, inevitably leads to the normalization of brutality. The modern rehabilitation of Guy Fawkes as a symbol of resistance to authority reflects broader changes in how society views the relationship between individual conscience and state power. What previous generations saw as terrorism, modern observers increasingly interpret as a legitimate response to religious oppression and political tyranny. The annual Guy Fawkes Night celebrations continue to evolve, with each generation finding new meanings in the 400-year-old story. Environmental activists use the occasion to protest against pollution, while political dissidents of all stripes invoke Fawkes's name to justify their own resistance to authority. This continued relevance suggests that the themes raised by his life and death, religious freedom, political resistance, and the limits of state power, remain as relevant today as they were in 6005. The story of Guy Fawkes's execution forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice, the limits of state power, and the resilience of human dignity in the face of systematic cruelty. His final leap from the scaffold represents more than just a desperate escape from physical pain. It stands as a testament to the human capacity for agency, even in the most constrained circumstances. The horror of what awaited Fawkes beneath that scaffold, the methodical dismantling of a living human body while consciousness was maintained, reveals the depths to which civilized society can sink when vengeance is disguised as justice. The fact that such executions were considered not just legal, but necessary for the maintenance of social order, demonstrates how easily brutality can be normalized when it serves the interests of those in power. Yet Fawkes's final act of defiance suggests that human dignity is not easily extinguished, even by the most systematic attempts at dehumanization. His choice to die on his own terms rather than submit to the prescribed ritual of torture represents a victory of the human spirit over institutional cruelty, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we retain the power to choose our response to oppression. The evolution of Guy Fawkes, from terrorist to folk hero, reflects our own evolving understanding of the relationship between individual conscience and state authority. Each generation has found in his story a reflection of their own struggles with power, resistance, and the price of standing up for deeply held beliefs. The methods of torture and execution employed against Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators belong to a dark chapter of human history that we would prefer to forget. But there is value in remembering these horrors, not to celebrate them, but to understand how easily societies can slip into barbarism when fear and hatred override compassion and justice. As we light our bonfires each November 5th and watch the sparks rise into the darkness, we might do well to remember not just the man whose name we invoke, but the deeper questions his story raises about power, justice, and human dignity, in a world where torture and systematic cruelty have not disappeared, but merely changed their forms. The 400-year-old story of Guy Fawkes remains disturbingly relevant. The true horror of Guy Fawkes's intended execution lies not just in the physical brutality that was planned, but in the casual acceptance of such cruelty as normal and necessary. His final act of defiance reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we retain the power to choose dignity over submission, courage over compliance, and hope over despair. That choice made in a moment of desperate circumstances for centuries ago continues to echo through history as a reminder of both the worst and the best of human nature. Yeah.